Hello, and welcome to Chapter 8 of my Ancient and Medieval World History. And in this chapter, we are going to sort of end with the ancient world and set up the medieval world, which we'll really kind of begin talking about fully next week. So, in the late classical period of Europe, the most visibly significant event, especially from the perspective of today's Westerners, was probably the growth and spread of Christianity. So, although we are going to look a lot at what happened in Europe, but also beyond it to the rest of the world during the same period, let's begin here. Christianity grew from a sect or a cult within Judaism to an independent religion kind of during the same period and, in a way, along with the diaspora of the Jewish people after their ejection from their homelands in the Levant in the first century. The good news or gospel of the Messiah, Jesus, was spread largely through Jewish synagogues at first, beginning, according to Christian tradition, with preaching by the original disciples. But in a very, very important development for the spread of this new faith, the evangelist Paul, who had previously been known as Saul of Tarsus, expanded the scope and the appeal of the new religion to Gentiles and invited non-Jews to embrace the message of salvation. Paul was constantly writing letters. This is what he's known for, writing letters to far-flung Christian communities throughout the Mediterranean world. Of the 13 canonical epistles or letters included in the New Testament, several, such as Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, 1 Corinthians, and Colossians, include explicit invitations to Gentiles to join this new religious community. Several of the first theological conflicts of Christianity actually involve which elements of Judaism applied to these new Christians, and which had been superseded by the teachings of Jesus. Among these were dietary restrictions and practices such as circumcision, which is required in the Hebrews' original covenant with their unnamed God, YHVH. Paul's practice of eliminating full adherence to Jewish law and his focus on urban regions such as Corinth and Ephesus and Rome accelerated the spread of Christianity into the Greco-Roman world. Christianity was especially attractive to people who lacked social standing and wealth. The new religion focused on building communities that would support their members and on embracing all believers regardless of their status as free or enslaved. So, although the new faith attracted some educated members of the elite who, for example, appreciated similarities between its theology and the Platonic ideal of a world of perfect forms, it also attracted the poorest and most desperate members of society, with both assistance and support in this world and hope for a better afterlife. This possibility of an eternal life in a better place mitigated some of the misery and horror of the present for many converts. But this may have worried some of Christianity's opponents, who kind of depended on fear and on punishment to control society and to maintain their own standing. Now, the history of early Christianity that's taught within the religion often focuses quite a bit on the sacrifices of martyrs who refused to renounce their faith, even when threatened with torture and violent death. Although many historians think legends of martyrdom are possibly exaggerated, many of the best documented of these martyrs died in Carthage in Roman North Africa. The region's Christian community had grown rapidly and refused to accommodate the Roman requirement of public sacrifices to the imperial gods. And these imperial gods included Julius Caesar and Augustus, who had both been deified. According to many sources, the Romans were initially content to allow their Christian subjects to practice their religion and considered their God to be just another of the multitude of divinities worshipped by people ruled over by the Roman Empire. The Christians, however, had inherited the monotheism of the Old Testament, and some refused to compromise or even to pretend to honor Roman gods that they considered illegitimate. Not all, however. In Carthage in 250, when the Emperor Decius required Christians to perform public sacrifices or face execution, many gave in to the pressure, while others who did refuse were killed in the arena. And this led to later church debates about whether to forgive the lapsed Christians. By 250 CE, when Decius's persecution went into effect, between 1 and 5% of the empire's 60 million people were Christians, or between 600,000 and 3 million. And also by 250, a hierarchical structure had been built in this new church, with bishops in Rome and Alexandria and Antioch. And also the removal of women from leadership roles that most historians agree they had almost certainly occupied in the early years of the faith. By the beginning of the 4th century, that is the early 300s, the Roman Empire was being fractured by civil wars and dynastic struggles. Flavius Constantius, a Roman army officer, became one of 4 joint emperors in what was called the Tetrarchy system. And his position passed to his son, Constantine, when he died in 306. Constantine, who lived from 272 to 337, was challenged by other claimants to these 4 imperial titles. Before a battle in 312 against one of these rivals, he claimed to have had a vision of the cross and the Greek words, "In this be victorious." This was translated into the Latin, "In hoc signo vinces," by this sign you will conquer. According to the legend, the following night he had a dream in which Jesus appeared and explained to him that he should use the sign of the cross against his enemies. And so he painted the chi and rho, the Greek letters that signified the Christos, or the Christ, onto his soldiers' shields, and they did win that fight. Another legend claims that Constantine's mother, Helena, was a commoner from Bithynia, the Anatolian province on the shore of the Black Sea, from which Pliny the Younger had written to the Emperor Trajan for advice about what to do with these Christians. And Helena, according to the legend, had instructed him as a boy. She was made a saint for this reason. Constantine defeated his imperial rival in that battle in 312, and in 313 he played an influential role in the Edict of Milan, which he made jointly with the other tetrarchs, which declared tolerance for Christianity in the Roman Empire. After ending the Tetrarchy and becoming the sole emperor in 324, Constantine almost immediately convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 to address theological disputes, and in particular the debate about the divinity or humanity of Jesus that was called the Arian controversy. And in addition to declaring Arianism a heresy and adopting the Nicene Creed, which is still a central element of Christianity, this council standardized the process for determining the date of Easter and also issued 20 canons or church laws regarding clergy discipline and also what to do with those lapsed Christians from Carthage. They were not excluded, but they were required to do 12 years of penance before being welcomed back into the community as full members or communicants. While the Council of Nicaea was a significant step forward for the legitimacy of the church in Roman society, in 325, Christians were still only about 10 to 20% of all Romans. Constantine continued to favor the new church, funding church projects such as the building of the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, exempting clergy from taxes, and appointing Christians to high offices. But it wasn't until 380 that Emperor Theodosius declared Nicene Christianity to be the official religion of the empire and actually banned pagan worship. In 330, Constantine moved his capital to Byzantium, which he renamed Nova Roma. Although the ancient city of Rome had been the official center and the heart of the empire, the city of Nicomedia in Bithynia had been the de facto center of Constantine's government. So he was really not quite moving from Rome to Byzantium as moving to a more strategic location on the other side of what's now Turkey. The city was already nearly 1,000 years old and controlled travel from the Mediterranean Sea into the Black Sea. The city was surrounded by water on three sides, and Constantine fortified the landward side with formidable walls. Constantinople, as it came to be called, it's now called Istanbul, also controlled important trade routes and was close to important military rivals, such as the Sasanian Empire in Persia. The Sasanian Empire had begun in 224 CE, when a conqueror named Ardashir I, who claimed descent from the Achaemenid emperors of the original Persian Empire, overthrew the Parthians. Internal strife and perennial conflict with the Roman Empire had weakened the Parthian Empire, and Ardashir organized a more centralized state with a capital at Ctesiphon on the Tigris River in present-day Iraq, about 20 miles from Baghdad. And the city was a center of Silk Road commerce, as Baghdad later became. It was a melting pot of Persian, Greek, and Mesopotamian cultures, with Zoroastrian fire temples, Christian churches, and Jewish synagogues. The Christians were members of the Eastern or Nestorian branch of the religion, which also spread through Armenia, Georgia, and Bactria, and possibly as far as India. During Constantine's promotion of Christianity, some Sasanian rulers came to distrust the Christians as possible allies of Rome and persecuted them. The proximity of their capital, Ctesiphon, to Constantinople, which was only about 600 miles away, was a danger, and their capital was sacked by the Roman army in 363 CE. Farther east, connected by trade with both the Roman and the Sasanian empires, the Gupta Empire of India, founded by Chandragupta I in 319, controlled the northern and eastern regions of the subcontinent. Culturally, this was the golden age of Sanskrit literature in India, and a period of standardization of Hindu theology and ritual. The Guptas, though, also tolerated Buddhism and Jainism, and their Nalanda University attracts students from China and from Central Asia. Gupta India was economically comparable in size to Rome or China, and built on its wealth to patronize science and mathematics. Ayurveda, medicine, and surgical techniques were developed, and the mathematician Aryabhata introduced the concept of zero, decimal notation, and trigonometric calculation. And in a demonstration of advanced metallurgy, the iron pillar of Delhi, erected under Chandragupta II, has remained free of rust for 1,600 years. Even farther east, the Chinese Empire had fallen into a chaotic period with the end of the Han Dynasty in 220 CE. In the middle decades of the 3rd century, 3 kingdoms rose, Wei, Shu, and Wu, which were followed by unification for about 50 more years under the Western Jin, with their capital at Chang'an. When this dynasty collapsed in 416, an Eastern Jin successor state established its capital at Jiangkang, which is modern Nanjing, in the south. Huge numbers of northern Han people moved south in the early 5th century, while the 16 kingdoms of the north were ruled mostly by non-Han ethnic groups like the Xiongnu. Although this lack of a single central government seems to challenge the idea that the Chinese Empire existed from its beginning in 221 BCE until 1911, in several important ways, the empire did persist. Chinese cultural traditions, based on Confucianism, Taoism, and Chinese writing, continued in both the south and the north. The Eastern Jin continued Han administrative techniques, including the 9-rank system of official appointments and the Confucian examinations. And the northern invaders became Chinese, adopting Chinese language, Chinese names, and Confucian rituals in a pattern of assimilation that would become typical for foreign conquerors in later Chinese history, like the Mongols and the Manchu. Finally, the mandate of heaven continued to be the basis of rule, with dynasties like the Jin using it to justify their claims to be the rulers of China, even if their control of territory was only partial. People who were probably cousins, or at least related to the Xiongnu, the Huns, were nomadic pastoralists who probably had originated in Central Asia, in the Altai Mountains, or on the Mongolian steppes. By the middle of the 4th century, they had begun migrating westward, displacing other nomads, such as the Alans and the Goths, who then moved westward and pushed Germanic tribes into Roman territory. They reached modern Ukraine and Russia by the 370s, also pressuring the Sasanian Empire's eastern borders. A group known as the White Huns began raiding Sasanian-controlled Bactria and Khorasan by the late 4th century, and even put pressure on the Gupta Empire that helped to lead to its decline. In Europe, the Huns pushed the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths into conflict with Rome, which led to a Germanic victory at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 that further weakened the Roman Empire. The European Huns reached their peak under Attila, who lived from about 406 to 453, and who ruled from 434 until his death. Attila crossed the Danube twice and invaded Anatolia in 441, but failed to conquer Constantinople, although he did extract 6,000 pounds of gold in tribute or ransom from the city. Attila invaded Gaul 10 years later, crossing the Rhine in 451 and reaching as far as Aurelianum, or Orleans, before being defeated by a coalition of Roman and Visigoth troops. And this is 41 years after the Visigoths sacked Rome, which we'll get to in a moment. Attila then turned south toward Italy and devastated northern Italy, but also, once again, failed to take Rome. Although the Huns were excellent cavalry warriors, they weren't that great at besieging cities. Especially under Attila, they preferred quick raids to plunder wealth and to extort tribute, rather than wasting their time capturing cities that they really lacked the administrative structures to govern. The Huns' dislocation of the Alans and the Goths resulted in the migration of the Visigoths from their original homes in the Black Sea region to ultimately seek refuge south of the Danube River. This forced other Germanic tribes, such as the Vandals, the Suebi, and the Burgundians, to move westward as well, across the Rhine into Roman Gaul. The Vandals crossed the Rhine in 406 CE. Following their victory over the Romans at Adrianople, the Visigoths under Alaric became federati, or allied troops. Rome's armies during this period consisted mostly of mercenaries rather than of Roman citizens. Alaric's demands for land, titles, and money were all ignored, and between 408 and 410, he besieged the city of Rome several times. The emperor, Honorius, had moved his government from Milan, which had been the capital, to Ravenna on the Adriatic coast in 402, so Rome was poorly defended. In August 410, Alaric's forces took the city and looted Rome for 3 days. Although this did not end the empire, it was a great symbolic defeat. After the death of Honorius in 423, the Western Roman Empire, based in Ravenna, was ruled by weak emperors, most of whom were under the thumbs of military leaders. By 475, a Germanic general named Orestes installed his son Romulus Augustulus as emperor of a government that really, by this time, only controlled part of the Italian peninsula. In 476, Another Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, rebelled and defeated Orestes at Piacenza. He quickly captured Ravenna and deposed the 16-year-old emperor. Rather than declaring himself Emperor of Rome, Odoacer took the title King of Italy under the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno, who was based in Constantinople. The former emperor was spared and retired to Campania. The sacking of Rome and the end of the Western Empire shocked the Christian world, leading to theological responses like Augustine's City of God. The Christian church in Rome survived both the sack of the city and the end of the empire, partly because Alaric's Visigoths were Christians, although ironically they were Arian Christians. They believed that heresy that had been outlawed at Nicaea. And partly because church leaders like Pope Innocent I had been actively negotiating with Alaric and emphasizing the church's neutrality and its spiritual rather than secular authority. The Visigoth leader ordered his men to spare Rome's Christian basilicas and focus instead on looting pagan temples and palaces and secular wealth, of which there was more than enough. After 476, when Odoacer conquered Ravenna, the new king recognized the Pope's authority over spiritual matters. He and his successor, Theodoric, were both Arian Christians, but they tolerated the Nicene Christianity practiced in Rome. And the church provided social continuity and fed people at the monasteries, which saved many during the collapse of the Roman state. It would continue to provide welfare and education and cultural continuity throughout what would become known as the Middle Ages, which we'll cover in the next chapter. One of the ways that historians have understood the survival of Christianity in Rome was by describing it as an early universalizing religion. These faiths are distinguished from smaller and more regional religions based on several characteristics. First, on universal appeal. They offer salvation or enlightenment or moral guidance to all people, regardless of tribal, ethnic, or regional boundaries. And this sets them apart from ethnic religions that tie themselves to specific groups of chosen people. Second, evangelism. They actively seek converts through preaching, missionary work, or cultural exchange, aiming to spread their teachings globally. Third, codified texts and institutions. They develop sacred texts, clergy, and organized structures to standardize beliefs and practices and enforce canonical orthodoxy across diverse regions. And fourth, ethical and cosmological frameworks. They provide comprehensive answers to existential questions such as the purpose of life. And they provide ethical guidelines that address the human condition rather than local concerns. Christianity was not the only universalizing religion at this time. Buddhism also displayed all these characteristics, and Zoroastrianism probably did as well. Another characteristic shared by Christianity and Buddhism is a tendency to adopt elements of regional faiths that provided advantages for the spread of the universal faith. Examples of this practice, which is called syncretism, include adopting pagan gods and rituals and symbols into Christianity, such as St. Brigid, who was a Celtic goddess, St. Nicholas, who was Poseidon, Christmas, which was the Roman midwinter festival of the Saturnalia, Easter eggs and bunnies, which were fertility symbols associated with Eostra or Ishtar, the fertility goddess, and the Madonna and Child, which began as Isis and her son Horus. In China, Buddhism adopted elements of Taoism, such as the Bodhisattva, that's an enlightened being who, after achieving nirvana, chooses not to leave the world until everyone has achieved enlightenment too. The Bodhisattva named Guanyin, also known as Avalokiteshvara, taking on attributes of the Taoist goddess Tsiwangmu, as well as a lot of folk medicine that was practiced in China. In Tibet, Buddhism adopted a lot from the shamanic, indigenous Boin religion. This added quite a bit of magic to Buddhism, ultimately resulting in the idea of reincarnated bodhisattvas known as tulkus. Coincidentally, the Dalai Lama is believed to be the reincarnation of that same bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, known as Chenrezig in Tibet. In the next chapter, we're going to see the beginning of another major world universalizing religion, Islam, and its spread out of the Arabian Peninsula during the period that is known in Europe as the Middle Ages. But that's all for now. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.